In the early 1800s, a man named John Bell packed up his belongings, his family, and everything he owned, and moved them to the quiet town of Red River, Tennessee, now known as Adams. He wasn't running from anything. He was running toward a better life. With acres of fertile farmland, a good reputation in the community, and strong Christian values, John Bell believed this was where his family would grow, thrive, and live in peace. For a few years, that's exactly what they did. The Bells built a large log house, planted crops, and became respected in the town. John's wife, Lucy, was kind and deeply religious. Their daughter, Betsy, was bright, innocent, and full of life. It was the kind of life anyone would envy, until it began to rot from the inside out. The first sign came in the form of noises. They were faint at first, easy to brush off. Knocks on the wall when no one was around. The sound of scratching inside the wooden beams at night. John assumed it was animals in the walls. They set traps. Looked around, found nothing. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more intentional, and more sinister. Then came the footsteps. They'd echo down the hallway when the entire family was seated at the table for dinner. Lucy would freeze mid-bite. John would grab his rifle. But there was never anyone there. One night, they heard someone pacing up and down the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, yet no one was outside. And then, as quickly as it came, silence. At first, they tried to ignore it, pretend it was just the wind, the house settling, their imaginations. But then things started to move. Shoes that were left by the fireplace would be found in the kitchen. Blankets pulled off beds in the middle of the night. A chair tipped over while the family was eating, as if shoved by an unseen hand. Something was there, watching them. And then, it began to speak. At first, it was just whispering. You'd walk into a room and swear someone had just finished a sentence. The voice was indistinct, like wind through a tunnel. But over time, the voice got louder, clearer. It began speaking in full sentences. And it wasn't just babble. It knew things, intimate things. It mocked John's prayers. Repeated secrets the children whispered to each other in private. It would say the names of their ancestors, names even John had forgotten. The family began to fear the night. Betsy, young, beautiful, and full of life, became the spirit's favorite target. Or perhaps, its favorite victim. It would pull her hair, slap her face, whisper in her ears while she tried to sleep. She'd wake up screaming, clawing at her sheets, red handprints on her cheeks and arms. She stopped smiling, stopped playing. She began to wither. John invited friends over, desperate for someone else to witness what was happening. And one by one they did. A neighbor named James Johnson and his wife spent the night at the Bell home. They didn't sleep. The knocking on the walls started the moment they lay down. Then came the voice, right between them, whispering their names. They ran back to town the next morning, pale and shaken. Word spread quickly. The story of the Bell family and their ghost, or demon, became a sensation. People came from miles around to witness it. Some mocked it. Others came to pray over the land. A few even brought their own children, hoping to prove it was all just a child's nightmare. But they left believing something dark had taken root in the Bell house. The spirit began calling itself Kate. Sometimes it would say it was the ghost of a neighbor who had died. Other times it claimed to be a demon sent to torment John Bell. But no matter the name or the voice it chose, it was clear. This thing was intelligent, and it hated John. The haunting grew more aggressive. Objects would fly across the room. Furniture would move on its own. Candles would blow out as soon as they were lit. The Bible, which Lucy Bell read every night, was torn in half in front of her eyes, the pages scattered by an invisible force. And always, that voice. Laughing, singing old hymns, quoting scriptures with a tone so mocking it made people shiver. And still, the worst was reserved for Betsy. One night, Betsy went to bed early after a day of relentless torment. Her mother found her an hour later, unconscious on the floor, her wrists covered in bruises. She had fainted from fear. When she awoke, she whispered, "She told me to die. She said I'd never leave." No one could explain it. Ministers were called. Some tried to exorcise the house. They failed. The spirit would laugh at them, call them names, and even mimic their voices. A traveling preacher once claimed the family was cursed, that someone in their bloodline had made a pact with something ancient. John Bell was enraged, but deep inside he feared it might be true. The haunting became so well known that even General Andrew Jackson, the future president of the United States, came to investigate. He brought a team of men and horses expecting superstition. But when they arrived near the Bell property, the horses refused to move. The wagon wouldn't budge. Then a voice deep and mocking rang out from nowhere. "You may come no closer." The wheels unlocked minutes later, but Jackson's men refused to step foot in the house. He left that night without ever crossing the threshold. What kind of power could stop a general in his tracks? What kind of hatred could focus so violently on one simple family? Whatever it wasn't done yet. By now, the Bell house was no longer just haunted. It was under siege. The spirit calling itself Kate no longer crept quietly in the dark. It had become a daily presence, a cruel and relentless force that tore at the sanity of every person inside that house. The Bell family had gone from curious to frightened, and now to broken. The torment wasn't just physical anymore. It became deeply psychological. Every morning, the family would wake up already exhausted. Through the night, the spirit would whisper in their ears, shout their names from distant corners, slam doors, and rattle their beds. It would mimic the cries of an infant when there was no child in the house. It would take on the voice of a dead relative, calling out in sorrow, then immediately burst into maniacal laughter. The days were no better. John Bell couldn't walk into a room without hearing his name hissed from behind him. Sometimes the spirit would call him Old Jack Bell, followed by curses and hateful taunts. It delighted in mocking him, shaming him in front of guests, and accusing him of sins long buried. The entity knew things no one else should have known. It exposed personal, private moments from John's past. Some believed it was reading his thoughts. Others thought it had lived in that land long before the Bells had arrived. For Lucy Bell, the spirit had a different attitude. Oddly, it showed her a strange form of respect. It once called her the most righteous woman in Tennessee. It would quote scripture to her, sometimes in multiple voices at once, as if mocking her faith, but never attacking her directly. It was almost as if the entity feared her strength. Lucy prayed constantly, holding a Bible close at all times, and even though the spirit tore it in half once before, it never touched her again. But for Betsy, the torment only grew. She could no longer sleep through the night. She refused to go to school. Her body trembled with anxiety. She would sit for hours without speaking, her eyes wide, as if she was seeing something no one else could. Sometimes she would speak in a low whisper, saying things that made no sense. Other times she'd scream until her voice gave out. Bruises appeared on her arms and neck. Once, she was found with a red handprint across her back so large, it looked like it had come from a full-grown man. The worst part? She began to believe the voice. It told her she was cursed, that no man would ever love her, that if she ever married, she would die. And it didn't stop there. The spirit began to fixate on a young man named Joshua Gardner, Betsy's childhood sweetheart. The two were engaged to be married. But the haunting grew worse every time they were together. The spirit would scream, wail, and throw objects whenever Joshua visited. It would accuse him of being a fraud. It even threatened to kill him if the marriage went forward. Eventually, broken and afraid, Betsy called off the engagement. John Bell, now in his 60s, had begun to deteriorate. He suffered from strange seizures, violent episodes where he would fall to the ground, convulsing and gasping for breath. His once strong body had become frail, his face pale. He lost weight rapidly. The doctors were baffled. There was no sign of illness, No infection, no injury, no explanation. The spirit often took credit. "I'm going to kill Jack Bell," it would say, sometimes multiple times a day. Once, John tried to leave the house alone, just to clear his mind. As he walked down a path toward the edge of his land, he felt a cold hand grasp his neck. He turned around. No one was there. Moments later, he collapsed. A neighbor found him lying on the dirt, unconscious, whispering something about fire and snakes. He had no memory of it afterward. That day, he couldn't speak clearly for hours. The local doctor claimed it was stress, but the family knew better. The Bell Witch was growing stronger. The entity had now begun interacting with visitors. It didn't hide anymore. A guest would ask it questions, and it would answer. Sometimes correctly, sometimes sarcastically. Once it recited an entire sermon being preached at a church 13 miles away, word for word, as it was happening. There were no phones, no radio, no way of knowing the content of that sermon unless something, or someone, had been there. It became impossible to deny that this was no trick, no imagination, no prank. This thing was real, and it was playing a game. As more and more people visited the Bell home, reports spread across the South. Newspapers didn't often report on supernatural tales, but local word of mouth had turned the Bell Witch into legend. Preachers, skeptics, scholars, even military men came to investigate, and most left deeply shaken. One well-known account came from a school teacher who stayed overnight. He was a man of science, reason, and logic. During the night, he claimed the bed he was sleeping on began to levitate. The walls vibrated, and a voice whispered, "Why don't you believe me now?" He left at dawn and never returned, but no one could stop it. Ministers prayed, family members wept. The Bell House became a fortress of fear, and everyone inside it was aging rapidly, not in body, but in spirit. Sleep was rare, peace was gone, and still the witch remained, watching, waiting, tormenting. One night the voice sang a lullaby in Betsy's ear, a lullaby her mother used to sing when she was a baby. Only Lucy had ever known those words. They had never been written down. The melody had been created by Lucy herself when Betsy was sick as a toddler. And now, something else was singing it. When Lucy asked, "How do you know that?" the spirit simply replied, "I remember everything." The land itself felt cursed. Crops began to fail. Animals acted strangely. Horses that refused to walk past certain spots. Dogs that howled all night at empty corners of the barn. The air smelled different, heavy, damp, and rotten, even in good weather. The Bells began to feel like prisoners on their own property. John's condition continued to worsen. He could barely walk without shaking. His speech was slurred. The witch laughed at him daily, mocking his weakness, claiming his death was near. The family began to fear the worst, and rightly so. The Bell Witch wasn't just a ghost, it was a hunter. And John Bell had been marked. And the final act of this nightmare, the one that would seal the Bell Witch legend forever, was about to begin. By the winter of 1820, John Bell was a shell of the man he used to be. Once a proud, respected farmer, now he could barely rise from bed without trembling. His speech had slowed, his vision blurred, and his soul seemed to wither. But worse than the physical pain was the mental torture. He was haunted every waking moment by the voice of the Bell Witch. Every prayer he whispered was mocked. Every step he tried to take was watched. His death was no longer a possibility. It was a promise. And the entity made sure the family knew it. "I will kill Jack Bell," it repeated daily. "He's mine." The days leading up to his final breath were filled with unnatural silence. The usual chaos, the knocking, the singing, the flying objects, stopped. Even the laughter ceased. It was as if the witch had grown quiet, waiting. It was the calm before the storm. On December 19th, 1820, John Bell slipped into a deep, sudden coma. His family rushed to his side. Lucy sat beside him for hours, holding his cold hand, tears silently falling down her face. Betsy knelt at the foot of the bed, whispering prayers. No one could understand what was happening. He had been weak, yes, but this was something else. Sudden, unnatural. Then, the witch spoke. In a loud, triumphant voice, it declared, "He'll never wake again. I gave him what he deserved." Lucy found a small, mysterious vial on the shelf near John's bedside, a dark, oily liquid inside a glass bottle. No one had ever seen it before. When asked, no doctor knew what it was. One of the sons offered a few drops to the family cat, and within moments, the cat convulsed and died. The witch laughed hysterically. "I gave him that potion," it said proudly. "I fixed old Jack good." On December 20th, 1820, John Bell died. It was the first and only time in American history that a spirit was blamed for murder. But the horror didn't stop at death. At John's funeral, dozens of neighbors and community members gathered to pay their respects. The preacher struggled through the service, trying to deliver comforting words, but his voice was constantly interrupted, not by mourners, but by the witch. It cackled through the air, loud and cruel, reciting twisted hymns and mocking John's memory. Witnesses claimed they heard her sing a warped version of a church song, not from a mouth or a body, but from the very air itself. The voice echoed through the trees and inside the walls of the church. Some guests ran out crying, others collapsed to their knees in fear. It was the most unsettling funeral anyone had ever attended. Soon after John's death, the witch's activity began to fade. It didn't disappear overnight. There were still knocks, whispers, and the occasional voice. But it was less violent, less consistent. And then one day it said something strange. "I'm leaving now, but I'll be back. In 7 years." And just like that, the Bell Witch was gone. For a time. The Return. 7 years later. In 1828, exactly 7 years later, the witch returned, but only to John Bell Jr., one of John's sons. For weeks, he claimed to hear the voice again. This time, it spoke of things far beyond the Bell family: wars, disasters, and the future of mankind. It predicted events with stunning accuracy, some of which didn't happen until decades later. Then, without warning, it vanished again. This time, for what many believed would be forever. But it wasn't. The Bell Witch Cave. The legend lives on today. The land where the Bell family once lived still exists. Most of the house is gone, decayed, and lost to time. But one thing remains: the Bell Witch Cave. A limestone cave near the original property, it is said to be the resting place, or hiding place, of the spirit. Strange events continue to occur there. Visitors report sudden cold spots. Some hear whispers. Others claim to be touched or pushed by invisible hands. Cameras malfunction. Voices appear in recordings. A few tourists even refuse to enter, overwhelmed with dread before stepping inside. Even more disturbing, some local children have reported seeing a woman near the cave entrance, old, pale, wearing tattered clothes, who disappears if approached. No one knows who she is, or what she is. The Bell Witch legend has inspired books, films, and countless ghost stories, but to this day, no one has explained exactly what the entity was. Some believe it was the ghost of a neighbor, Kate Batts, a woman rumored to have cursed the land after a land dispute with John Bell. Others believe it was a demonic force feeding on fear. Some say it was a powerful poltergeist created by the trauma of the family itself. And a few believe it was something even older, a force tied to the land itself, something that waits, watches, and awakens when disturbed. The final warning. What happened in that farmhouse wasn't a ghost story created for fun. It was documented, eyewitnessed, feared, experienced by dozens, including ministers, teachers, and even military leaders. It was powerful enough to end a man's life, smart enough to speak scripture, evil enough to destroy a family. And maybe, just maybe, it never left. If you ever find yourself in Adams, Tennessee, and the wind dies down suddenly, if you hear footsteps behind you but no one's there, or if a voice whispers your name from inside the cave, don't answer, because the Bell Witch never forgets, and she may be waiting for you next.